Garlich, thanks for sitting down with me today. I appreciate it.
More than welcome, Sean, like always.
Garlich, as we've been discussing here in Warsaw for the last couple of days, the EU has proposed a number of changes to the plant and animal health legislation to enhance food safety across the bloc. It's taken a lot of work, I'm sure, to get to this point. Can you tell us a little bit about the process that you've walked on and some timeframes that tie into that?
You're right, it's a long process that we've been through already. The whole debate started with an evaluation of the existing legislation around about 2008 that involved questionnaires to stakeholders, not only to the plant breeding community, but also then to animal breeders, to farmers, national authorities, plant variety offices all over Europe, and of course, last but not least, also international partners. So that has taken us well into 2011. Before the Commission then finally basically drew its conclusions from this, and over the year of 2011 and 12 developed its proposal for a new legislation. And again, it's a very wide proposal. It's covering not only what we now call plant reproductive materials, so basically seed, but also indeed it covers plant health, it covers animal health, and that is the new element really, is the inclusion of all of that under the authority of the European Union's Food and Veterinary Office. That's the element of the safer food. That would not say that the food has not been safe so far, but it's more to say we already have most of our policy areas included in the responsibility of the European Union together with member states, whereas in the area of plant health and seed, we have had largely national responsibility. And now in the future we're going to have a combination of national responsibility and execution, but also supported and controlled by a European body, the Food and Veterinary Office in Ireland.
Why is it so important that ESA be at that table for those discussions and to participate at that level?
I think in seed and in plant health, we are in very technical fields of discussion. And of course, national regulators are usually well aware of all the technicalities, also the differences between different crops. But what also is new is that for the first time, this new legislation will be discussed not only by the Council of Ministers, meaning also with that national ministries and well-educated and well-experienced people in national ministries. But it is an open, a public political debate that involves the European Parliament. The European Parliament has never been involved in our legislation in the past. So we are a relatively new sector and relatively new subject to them. So for us it was very important from the start to engage with politicians, but also with the wider society, with society at large, to explain why is this legislation so important for us? Why are we also maybe in the seed sector slightly different than looking at commodities, for example? Most people do not realize that, for example, a kilogram of tomato seed is worth more than a kilogram of gold. So these kind of very basic facts need to be explained first before you can actually enter into the kind of discussion that we need to have now, which is then more really on the detailed technicalities, the differentiations depending on the crops and on the different diseases that we're talking about.
Can you share with us a little bit about how some of these changes will impact, or maybe the key changes are going to impact on breeders and maybe on farmers as well? Mm-hmm. Is it going to make things easier or more complicated?
I think it potentially may do both. We have, on the one hand, a simplification. The simplification merely comes already from the simple fact that we are going to integrate the existing almost 25 or 28 different pieces of legislation in de facto 2. So we will have one single regulation for seed and one single regulation for plant health. In the past we had many different texts developed over a long period of time, which also then still needed to be implemented by national legislation. So it was what we call directives. So they require an implementing legislative act on national level. That will no longer be the case. So we will have directly applicable European legislation. That in itself will already help harmonization, which is also an important objective. When the seed legislation was devised, it applied to 6 countries in the, at that time, European Economic Community. Now we are 28, highly differentiated between the newest addition to the bloc, Croatia, Greece, Finland, Germany. And so I think there is simplification, there's harmonization, there's more clarity. All of that is positive. At the same time, the legislation also tries to, or is at least put forward as a try to exempt very small operators from certain obligations, both in variety registration and seed certification, but also then in plant health. And that is something that we look at very critically. We think that this is potentially dangerous and counterproductive. If we want to have an effective phytosanitary system, if we want to effectively avoid the spread of diseases and the introduction of new pests into Europe, we cannot exempt a large part of the market from any form of control or certification. And the same, I think, is true for, indeed, seed, new plant varieties. Again, we have a number of derogations and exemptions in the proposal of the European Commission that are looked at very critically, in particular by our smaller companies. In fact, from what we know from our membership, in particular our small companies want to be part of the legislation. They don't want to be exempt because they know that A, for them it's a matter of credibility also towards their customers, towards the farmers and the growers, who will want to know, are you part of a system that is officially recognized and controlled, or are you outside of it? So our feeling is that the exemptions and derogations are maybe well intended, but we feel that they're going too far.
That's a great explanation, Garlich. How do we expect these changes to impact on the flow of seed globally? The European Union has not necessarily been the easiest to maneuver seed around in. Is this going to clean some of that up as well?
I think it will help as far as, in particular, phytosanitary legislation is concerned. Now there we have, on the one hand, this new discussion here in Europe about a new phytosanitary legislation that will, in particular, address some of the problems that we've had with export and re-export certificates. So that should indeed facilitate the movement, not only inside, but also then, again, from other third countries into Europe and then maybe onwards to, again, third countries. So there we're quite hopeful that that is going to improve things. We also have a parallel discussion, of course, as you know, about the so-called TTIP, the Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement with the United States, and a similar one with Canada. And there's talk about having more of such bilateral agreements with, for example, Brazil and others. Also there, I think phytosanitary issues, rules have been identified as an area where we can achieve a lot of simplification, making use of modern technology like electronic certificates, etc., mutual recognition of our standards. So I think all of that could potentially improve the situation. At the same time, we have to also, I think, still consider that the main stumbling block for a lot of trade of significant order in the area of seed is not phytosanitary rules. And is also not necessarily variety registration requirements. It is usually, it's biotechnology. It's the fact that there is a likelihood, in particular in countries in North and in South America, that you will have some adventitious presence of biotechnology also in seed. That can never be excluded. And under the draconian, and from our point of view, completely unnecessary and unjustified zero tolerance approach of the European Union, that is a very risky business. So we have de facto, with that policy, stopped a lot of the usual exchange of seed that characterized the trade relationship with, in particular, the United States, maybe in the 80s and the 90s still.
Another area that's been a big topic of discussion here, and I think a big success for ESA, has been the ESTA initiative, the seed treatment initiative. Can you tell us a little bit about where that's at and what your expectations for the future are?
Yes, we are now really in the process of implementing this quality assurance scheme. We have developed it over a good 2.5 years. We finalized all the necessary standards, a kind of a checklist that helps independent auditors looking into companies and certifying that they really are aware of how to best produce treated seed and achieve certain quality standards. That now is really being rolled out in the different member states. We now have more than 35 treatment sites that are already under the scheme. We have another round about 35 that are very close to finishing their respective audits and then being accredited and certified. But of course there still needs to be done more. We have, in particular in the area of cereals, we have many, many more treatment sites. It's a different structure than, for example, in maize or in oilseed rape or in vegetables. So there is still a long way to go, and our objective is indeed to make this the quality assurance scheme that everybody in the seed trade follows. Not only because we're convinced it's a good scheme, but also because we think we need, as an industry, to have a real common standard, and with that also to show that we are having some form of, let's say, solidarity amongst each other, because we protect each other's business. Only if we all are living up to certain quality standards can we be sure that regulators, but also those that criticize the use of seed treatments for principal reasons, have no possibility of accusing us that we are not doing what we could do, that we are not meeting the quality standards that we have set.
I'm going to ask you to look deep into the future for me, or maybe hopefully not too deep, but can we attach any timelines or projected timelines to some of these pieces? And some of it will be an opinion. When do you see the EU being able to make some decisions as far as seed law, as far as phytosanitary issues? And when do you think that the ESTA initiative will be fully in swing?
Let me maybe start with the last one. So our objective was that within 24 to 36 months after the launch, we would have somewhere around 90% of the market covered. I think it is realistic that we achieve that for maize, for oilseed rape, for vegetables, for sugar beet, for soybeans, etc. But of course, cereals will be a challenge. There we will very likely need to work closely with our national associations, maybe develop more national-based programs than a Central European one. But as I said, I'm hopeful that next year, when we have our annual meeting in Lisbon, we will be able to show that at least for those crops that I mentioned earlier, we are already pretty close to achieving that goal. When we think about the plant reproductive material and the plant health law, I think it's a bit less predictable. Why? Because it also concerns the upcoming elections in the European Parliament next year in May. So we still hope that we will be able to finish at least a so-called first reading in the responsible committees, that's the Committee for Agriculture and the Committee for the Environment, by April next year. So before the Parliament goes into recess for the new election. So that will be our hope. But until then, indeed, the final decision is taken together with the Council of Ministers, and until then, all the implementing legislation, so the smaller, more technical annexes that will still need to be decided, until all of that is finished, very likely, indeed, another 2 or 3 years will need to be expired.
Okay. We've just finished up here in Warsaw. Your Congress this year had over 850 participants. Yes. Continues to grow every time I come. It continues to get bigger. Congratulations for that, and a fantastic event. Any thoughts on how your event went this year? Anything kind of stand out as being important from the work that was done here in the over the last couple of days?
I think what we can say is, on the one hand, indeed, it's true. We continue to grow. That is, of course, a positive sign. So I think it is showing that the membership is content with the quality of the organization. I only got many positive comments alongside the last 3 or 4 days. So we also collaborated very well with our national association here in Poland. And that is also one aim that we have with taking the Congress into third countries and not staying in Brussels, is also to really interact with our respective national association and demonstrate to their ministries and their officials in regulatory bodies who are we as a European sector. So that, I think, has worked quite well, also this year here in Warsaw, and I'm quite confident that that is also going to be the case in the future. I think what stood out in total was it is indeed a very vibrant industry that continues to become more and more international, not only driven by markets but also by more and more international supranational politics. What we discussed today and yesterday was, for example, the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. We have discussed not only the European but also the American approach to seed treatment stewardship. We're looking at the TTIP that I just mentioned. So many of the rules out there affect not only Europeans, but increasingly also other parts of the world. And all our companies do business not only in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. So it's a quite natural, I think, development that also this Congress has become more and more international. We are not a second ISF Congress, not yet. But we already have many people from America, from Russia, from Australia, from Africa coming also to the European Congress to hear what is going on in Europe, because very often we are either the first to sense some trouble or indeed we are also a very important market. So I think this exchange also becomes more fruitful, more meaningful because of that wider participation from around the world.
You folks have been great hosts to us here, and thanks very much for sitting down with me. I appreciate it, Garlich.
More than welcome, and I hope to see you again then next year in Lisbon.